John and I's marriage has always been full of complicity, small adventures, and endless conversations at night about our dreams and fears. In the early years, we were inseparable, and I felt that nothing could ever separate us. But, like everything in life, routine began to settle in. Work commitments, the need to deal with daily responsibilities, and small frustrations started to take the place of the spontaneity and passion that had brought us together. Over time, John started traveling, more for work. He always had a hectic career, but in the beginning I felt that his absence gave me space to focus on other things. I took the opportunity to dedicate myself more to my work, my hobbies, and even our dog, Max. Max had always been a constant presence, but until then he played the traditional role of a pet, someone to walk and play with, but not necessarily an emotional companion. When John was home, the attention was all on him, and Max was in the background. However, things began to change gradually. John started traveling more frequently, staying away for weeks at a time, and the space he left became bigger with each trip. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that I was fine, that I would have more time for myself, but as time passed, loneliness began to occupy a space I wasn't prepared to deal with. The nights became especially difficult when everything was silent, and I found myself alone with my own thoughts. It was then that Max began to change his behavior. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Max, who had always been quite independent, now seemed to seek me out in a different way. He stayed closer to me, sitting beside me while I watched TV, lying at my feet while I read or typed on the computer. I was surprised but also comforted. In the quietest moments, when the house felt even emptier, he was there, offering me simple but sincere affection. Max began sleeping in bed with me on the nights John wasn't home. He would come to me, lying on my chest as if he wanted to hug me, and without thinking much about it, I let him. There was something almost therapeutic about his presence, something that gave me a wordless comfort. He didn't question, didn't demand. He was just there, willing to offer what he knew best, unconditional love. At first, this seemed normal to me. Max was my companion, and I enjoyed his company, especially when loneliness weighed heavily. But little by little, something began to unfold in my mind and heart. I realized my emotional dependency was changing. I no longer just sought Max's company. I needed him. He had become my refuge, my silent comfort in a home that now felt strangely empty without John. John, on his end, was more distant than ever. Our conversations, once filled with laughter and plans for the future, were now brief and full of formalities. He would call to ask about work, how I was handling things alone, but it was always a cold conversation. He seemed to lose the ability to see what was happening with me, or perhaps he didn't want to see. I tried subtly to say that I missed him, that it was difficult to deal with the distance, but he was too busy to notice. Work, travel, and commitments took all his attention, and I felt more and more invisible to him. And it was there, in the emotional void that began to form, that my emotional infidelity unfolded silently. I found myself seeking comfort in Max that I could no longer find in John. The dog was becoming a kind of emotional support for me. He was there, always ready to welcome me, while I felt abandoned, not physically, but emotionally, by John. I didn't know how to deal with it anymore. I started wondering if I was being unfair to John. I knew he was working hard, that he was away for both of us, trying to build a future, but his absence made me question if what we were building was still worth it. I felt like he was pulling away, and his trips, though justified, were creating a gap between us. I tried to fill this gap with Max's presence, but I soon realized I was drifting away from John in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. One particularly difficult night after a long and exhausting day, I found Max lying beside me, as usual. He looked at me with his loyal eyes, as if he knew what I was feeling. I felt a lump in my throat, but at the same time, a sense of comfort. He was there for me. No questions, no demands, just offering me his affection and attention. Deep down, I knew this presence was temporary, that he couldn't fill the void I felt in my marriage. But in that moment, he was the only thing I could hold on to. When John returned from his trip, he noticed something was different. He looked at me with a mix of concern and confusion, asking why I was so distant, why we no longer talked like we used to. I knew I needed to be honest, but at the same time I was afraid of hurting him. I wanted to tell him how I really felt, how emotionally neglected I had been, but the words wouldn't come. It was then, in a moment of vulnerability, that I finally admitted what was happening. I was seeking comfort in Max because with him, I felt a constant presence, something I no longer felt with John. I was pulling away from him emotionally, in a way I never imagined I was capable of. Max wasn't to blame. He had nothing to do with it. But somehow, he became a reflection of what was missing in our relationship. John, surprised, listened to me attentively. He knew he hadn't been a perfect husband, but he also knew that we were both failing to communicate. The conversation was painful, but also freeing. I realized that, despite everything, there was still a chance to reconnect, to rebuild what had been broken. It wouldn't be easy, but honesty between us was the first step. Max, as always, came closer to us during the conversation, settling beside us, offering that silent affection only he knew how to give. He didn't know what was happening, but his presence in that moment symbolized a simple truth. Love and loyalty don't need to be complex. They are in the simplicity of everyday life, in those moments when we choose to be present, even when, at times, we are so lost we don't know what to do.